Hey guys, let's go here. This is a video breaking down all the changes from the Rules Reference Guide 1.5 update. This was really daunting to think about making because there are a lot of changes because it's been a long time since an update. Overall, I think the update is awesome and that the Rules Reference Guide and the article that accompanied it did a pretty good job of breaking down the major concepts. But I have had a lot of people reaching out to me asking me to make a video because rules nerdiness is something I'm known for, so I figured I would take a crack at this. So what I did to make this video is I went through the rules reference guide, and pretty much anytime there was a change or an update that I thought was worth mentioning, I pulled out a card that I thought would represent that change that I can use to run through this. So this isn't in any particular order. We're just going to hopefully rapid fire through as many changes as possible and give you guys an idea of what's changed in 1.5, or at least some of these aren't really changes per se, but just things that are codified in the rules that weren't codified before. So if anything in this video is confusing or you have a question, drop it in the comments. I can make more detailed videos breaking down bigger and more advanced parts of these concepts. This is going to be really surface level, kind of just a survey. So one change, permanent. So cards with the permanent upgrade are set aside during step 1 of setup. They're not included in your deck size, and they are not shuffled in. You don't draw them into your hand, and they are usually put into play by an effect later. So that is where Logan's claws are actually going to be. He is never going to find them in his deck or discard pile. He's actually getting errata to just put them into play. But those are where his claws were the whole time. Permanent cards such as Phased work in that way. Unfortunately, Vision still doesn't get his hand size until his setup ability puts it into play. But if you play otherwise, I'm not going to come to your house and stop you. Another huge change, perhaps the biggest change, is a new set of rules called Valid Target, or Target, actually, which replaces the game state change rule. So I don't want to spend too much time on what the old game state change rule was, but it got complicated because it involved caring about what abilities the rule did or didn't care about, and it wasn't actually asking about actual changes to the game. So anyway, the new target rules determine when you can play a card or trigger an ability, and put simply, you need to have a valid target in order to play an ability, or to play a card or initiate an ability. And all kinds of things can be targets, like a certain card or a player or whatever. Of course, the question to actually ask yourself is what makes a target valid? And it needs to meet whatever conditions the card has for its target. Like if it says deal damage to a minion, it needs to be a minion. And your card needs to be able to affect that target. So besides hopefully being easier to parse, the rule is actually a little more permissive than the previous version of the rules in a couple of ways. And I have a handful of cards that are going to show that off. So if you have a card that could have multiple targets, you only need at least one valid target in order to play that card. So melee can deal damage to up to 2 different enemies, but now you can play this card if there's only one enemy in play, because you have, probably the villain, because you have at least one valid target. If a target is not, if one enemy is not a valid target for an ability, and it targets other targets, you can still play the card. So this allows dive bomb to happen when there's a guard minion in play, because if there's a guard minion in play, you're not able to play an attack event that would destroy or deal damage to all enemies. That used to be the case. Now you can, because guard says you cannot attack the villain. That makes it not a valid target. The ability that you're playing or resolving just won't resolve against the enemy that cannot be whatevered. So if you play dive bomb, your first 7 damage can't target the villain, needs to target some other thing that isn't blocked by guard. If the guard minion is still alive, for the second sentence, deal 1 damage to each other enemy. That sentence will still happen, it just won't resolve against the villain. So that's very nice. If a card has multiple different effects, only one of them needs to be able to affect the enemy. So you can play Concussive Blow against a confused enemy because you can still deal damage to it. To help our girl She-Hulk out, they have decided that basically target rules trump an ability being forced. So if a forced triggered ability would not have a valid target, it does not resolve. So that means this forced response is not going to resolve if the attacked enemy cannot be stunned, either because they are stalwart or because they are already stunned. So that's handy. We get to keep our superhuman strength around if you jump through the necessary hoops to keep your target stunned. Like the game state change rule, the target rule only cares about the effects of a card, not its cost. So what doesn't kill me has a cost of heal 2 damage from your hero, and that must be paid in order to play the card. However, when you're asking whether this card is a valid target, it's only the effect, ready your hero, that we care about. So all that to say is if your hero is already ready, you can't play What Doesn't Kill Me because you don't have a valid target. It doesn't care whether you can heal your hero or not, although that is a cost to play the card. For target, it just says ready your hero, and your hero is already ready, so you cannot be affected by that ability. So it is not possible to play. Any effect that would cause you to do something that some other effect says you cannot do makes it an invalid target. So I already used the example of guard. Guard says you cannot attack the villain, so that means the villain is not a valid target for attack effects. This card says attached character cannot ready or change form, so that means your hero would be an invalid target for example, What Doesn't Kill Me, what we were just looking at. And finally, cards that have like a future target, such as Death Focus, it says reduce the resource cost of the next card you play. Those don't require a target to initiate because it would be very difficult to litigate that. So that's my basic breakdown of valid target. Hopefully that makes some sense. That's definitely something that could be a more detailed breakdown in the next video. Speaking of things that could be a more detailed breakdown is damage, dealing it, taking it, and preventing it. So damage is dealt and taken. Basically, dealt is from the perspective of whatever is causing the damage to happen, and taking is from the perspective of what the damage is actually landing on. It's taking damage that actually reduces your health. It's when you take damage that you actually put damage counters on, or when you take damage that you actually reduce your health. And basically, some cards care about one number or the other. And if you affect the amount of damage that you're dealing, it's kind of like a funnel from deal to take. So if you increase the amount of damage that you're dealing, then the amount that you take is affected. But if you're dealt a certain amount of damage and you change how much of that you take, you are still dealt the same number of damage. So changing take doesn't change deal, but changing deal does change take. So that will result in some things to work a little differently than they might used to. Like there's some treacheries that say like, if this dealt such and such an amount of damage, blah, blah, blah. This means that things that prevent that damage no longer cause that to not trigger because that damage was still dealt, it just wasn't taken. Furthermore, when the dealing or taking of damage is interrupted, there's a hierarchy to those things. So first, tough has the highest priority and triggers first, then interrupts to the dealing of damage trigger, and then interrupts to the taking of damage trigger. So if Venom is about to deal damage to me with an attack, this interrupt would trigger first, and I would remove things from the bell tower and prevent damage. Then remember that this preventing would change the amount of damage that I'm taking. It wouldn't change the amount that I'm dealt. But if I'm still about to take any amount of damage, then I could play sidestep afterwards, prevent 3 of that damage. Once again, this is a prevent, which means I was still dealt that damage. I just stopped myself from taking it. So hopefully that's making some sense. That's another thing we could dive into. An important note about taking damage is if it is in a cost, then it must happen in order to pay the cost. So Focused Rage is a classic example. It says exhaust it and take 1 damage. If that damage is somehow mitigated, for example by sidestep, you have not paid the cost. You do not get to resolve the effect. Something written like Think Fast just has take 1 damage as an effect, which means it doesn't matter whether you mitigate that or not, the rest of the card will still continue resolving. All right, we got a bunch of clarifications and just new things codified about enemy attacks. One of them is when attacks deal indirect damage, we don't really care about who actually suffered that damage when we're asking who got attacked. The target of the attack and whoever defended against the attack is still the person that got attacked. Other characters that took damage they did happen to take damage, but they were not the target of the attack. So the attack itself doesn't like split into a bunch of targets. It's still against the one person that is actually the target of the attack or defending against the attack. They codified the fact that these different effects all happen at the same time. So after an enemy attacks, response after enemy attacks, response after hero defends, response after you use a basic power, in the case of basic defending, all of those happen in the same window, after the enemy's attack damage is dealt, after step 4 of the enemy attack sequence. So in this case, Dr. Octopus's would happen first because it is forced, and then the player would have the choice of resolving Counterpunch or Quicksilver in the order that you wish, because they're both responses. They also talked about if an attack is somehow canceled while it is happening in relation to after you defend against an attack. So if you use Powerful Punch and defeat an enemy before that attack resolves, or if you use Grasping Tendrils, which will cancel that attack, they ruled that after so-and-so attacks, things will not trigger in that situation. So Dr. Octopus's ability would not resolve. However, you did defend the attack, so you are able to play after you defend things. So you could use Counterpunch like we had before, and you can trigger Unflappable. They noted that the after attacks you triggered condition, like after Radioactive Man attacks you, that triggers regardless of whether an ally defended the attack or not. That you is referring to the target player of the attack. So it is technically an exception to the you rule because characters can be attacked, but that is just the intended way for this kind of response to trigger. If it says after so-and-so attacks you, it's talking about the player. Remember that if it says attacks and damages you, it actually cares about your ID because only identities can take damage. Players cannot take damage. The rules defined the phrase declare so-and-so the defender of an attack. This card also got errata to get the defense label, but declare so-and-so the defender means what Shield Maiden thinks it means. It means your hero, if it's on a hero, it means you're considered to be making a basic defense, so your defense will be applied to that attack, and you cannot basic defend again to like double tap. You're already doing that. Basically, declare the defender is just the name of the thing that you do when you basic defend. And if an ally is declared the defender of an attack, they are considered to be defending that attack, but they can only defend attacks in one way, so that's not as important there. 1.5 states extremely clearly that you can play defense cards when an attack is not happening, and that doesn't count as defending, but their trigger condition needs to be true. So a very common example is sidestep, when you would take any amount of damage, blah, blah, blah. You can do this when you're taking damage from any reason. It doesn't need to be an attack. It doesn't need to be during attack. They've also codified the fact that you can play defense cards if their trigger condition is true while an ally you control is defending. And this is usually going to be made true by effects like sidestep responding to overkill damage, because your ally is technically still in play, technically still defending at that moment, and you're going to be able to play sidestep to block overkill damage in that situation. When a character defends an attack, from that moment on, who you is changes on any abilities that trigger. So any abilities that triggered before the attack still remembered who you was at that time. So something like that, like Ultron would care about that. But effects like the Infinity Stones, which trigger after an activation, they have a U in them, and they're going to care who the activation ended against. So that's how we were resolving a lot of things anyway. That is now codified. There is a little hierarchy to effects that trigger towards the end of an attack. So they now the rules officially state that after you take damage, triggers before retaliate, which triggers before response after you defend, or response after you attack. Remember, there's actually a lot of different effects that are all in this category. So you would have to be playing some kind of variant game mode to have all these in the same deck, but if you had all of this, you would trigger counterattack first, then you would trigger retaliate, and then you would be able to trigger counterpunch. There are now 2 choose rules. So the rules used to only define choose in the case of what is now called choose game element. So we talked about choosing a card or a target or something. while we had lots of cards that actually used to choose in a different way, to choose between different possible effects. A really common example is obligations. They almost always say choose two different things. So there's now two rules. This is called choose option and choose game element. They've codified some things about the choose option rule, where you have to choose the option that you can most fully fulfill. If you can only fully fulfill one, you have to choose that option. And if you can't fully fulfill either, you have to choose the one that you can most fully fulfill. Choose, in the case of choosing a game object, still has some superpowers that I don't think they want it to have, but they have ruled that they don't want cards to be blocked from being playable if the whole ability is not dependent on choose. So a card that often comes up in this conversation is phase disruption. It says confuse an enemy, then choose an attachment, blah, blah, blah. They still want this card to be playable if you cannot choose an attachment. So I think how this basically boils down is that if choosing a game element is a cost of a card, you must absolutely do it, yes. But if choosing a game element is just a sentence within a card's ability, I think what they mostly want us to do with that is just use valid target rules to resolve those things. So this is something that's still a little bit up in the air. This wasn't totally solved by 1.5, so we got some pending questions, and we'll learn more about that sooner or later. Something I love about 1.5 is interrupts are given an official timing that is closer to how they actually work. So the reference guide used to say that interrupts happened before their timing, before whatever they're interrupting happens. They would happen when it becomes imminent. That is simply not when a lot of interrupts actually happen. Their thing like needs to happen. Like an example is preemptive strike. It says when a boost card is turned face up, you need to care about how many boost icons are on that card. So actually it happens right after the card is turned face up. So they've codified this. Now, instead of saying it happens when it's imminent, interrupts happen after their trigger condition initiates, but before it resolves. So immediately after the start of the thing, but before the thing really has an impact on the game. Furthermore, if an interrupt says would, so it'll say when such and such would happen, that triggers basically the old interrupt timing. It happens before the thing initiates. So these two are a good example. They both interrupt the turning over of a boost card. Preemptive strike doesn't have would. It just says when a boost card is turned face up. So this is playable immediately after the card is turned face up, but before the boost icons are actually applied to anything. Defiance, on the other hand, says when a boost card would be turned face up. So this happens before you see the card, when it is still face down. So there are a lot of other things like this. Interrupts happen after a thing initiates, but before it resolves, and would interrupts happen before something initiates. That's going to be important for some errata later. A fun thing that 1.5 gave us is it technically gives us the ability to trigger triggered abilities on encounter cards, which we weren't very clearly able to do because we can't control them. But now we can, even ones that include costs. So taking actions or responses on encounter cards, especially responses and interrupts, are now allowed. So you can use this response on Magneto's armor to remove it. Obligations are, as they have been, an exception to that rule. No other players can trigger triggered abilities that are on an obligation besides a player that it is attached to. And furthermore, there's a new rule that if there is an attachment attached to your identity, if there are triggered abilities on that attachment that use the word you or your, only the player that the attachment is attached to can trigger those abilities. So an example is Wrapped in Metal. It says exhaust your identity and spend a fist resource, discard this card. Unfortunately, only the player who Wrapped in Metal is attached to is actually able to do that. There is a timing structure where they have decided to land on allowing constant abilities to trigger before status cards, which means intangible protects tough. Yay, good for vision. Clarity about boost cards, especially in multiples, is that they are resolved one at a time instead of the previous entry could have been read pretty ambiguously. But you flip each card individually and resolve it one at a time until there are no more remaining. Defending can protect tough. It also prevents damage from being dealt and damage from being taken. So we know that Groot's basic defense can protect his forced interrupt. It can now also protect tough. Yay. Basic powers have actually been given some extra restrictions that they didn't have. So in 1.4, basic powers were not abilities, so they were not beholden to the game state rule. So you could basically take a basic action no matter what, regardless of whether there was something you could actually do with it. This was pretty helpful because Hulk's zero thwart could never actually change the game. There have actually been new restrictions added to attack and thwart, which are kind of a slightly weakened version of valid target. So in order to attack, there needs to be an enemy that can be attacked. And in order to thwart, there needs to be a scheme with threat on it. Note the very slight difference is you don't currently need to actually be able to affect that target with your attack or your thwart. So our friend Hulk here still is technically able to thwart for 0, even though he's not able to thwart that attachment. Also, both of those rules are circumvented if you are afflicted with the appropriate status. So if you're stunned, you can use a basic power to remove the stunned. If you're confused, you can use a basic thwart to remove that confused. They also want that to be true of events. Probably we have some pending questions on that, but it seems that the intent is they want to allow you to play events that are attacks or thwarts in order to remove the appropriate status, even if there's not a valid target for that card otherwise. That same restriction was not applied to recover in the rules reference 1.5, but we know from very recent rulings that they intend to add one. I don't know if it's going to be exactly the same as the other ones, because they don't need to be able to affect their target. So if I had to guess, I would say the direction they're going to go is like your ID with damage on it needs to exist as a valid target, and technically you don't need to actually heal the damage from your identity, but your identity not being healed or not being damaged, I guess, would not be a valid target. Their intention is for these things to ultimately work the same way. Another awesome thing that is finally very well laid out in the rules is how attacks with multiple instances of damage and effects that increase the amount of damage that something deals works. So this has been a cool interaction we've had since Miss Marvel with Melee and Embiggen, but there are now rules about it that actually explain how attacks against multiple targets work. So Melee is an attack and it does multiple instances of damage. If you use an effect that says that event or that attack deals 1 additional damage, it's going to apply that effect to each instance. So if you used aggressive energy to pay for melee, it's going to deal 4 damage to an enemy, then 4 damage to another. Warrior skill is a similar effect that applies to attacks instead of events. These almost always work the same way, except in the case of events that have multiple attacks in them. If you use aggressive energy on such a thing, it will actually apply to all of the attacks of an event. But warrior skill only applies to individual attacks, so one use of warrior skill will only affect one attack on such an event. You would have to trigger it again to trigger it on another attack of such a kind. They also codified something they said about Wolverine's Claws. Wolverine's Claws causes you to play an event, and then it says that attack gains piercing, which is a little dissonant if your event has multiple attacks, which he has in his kit. So they've ruled, and 1.5 codifies that if something applies to that attack triggered by an event that has multiple attacks, it will only apply to the first attack. So if you play Slice and Dice with Wolverine's Claws, the first attack will have piercing, the second one will be normal. All right, 1.5 has rules about costs and overpayment. So our favorite Moon Girl decision, costs, when you generate resources to pay for a cost, the amount that actually fulfills the cost is paid for that cost. And any amount in excess of that is generated and it is spent, but it is overpaid and it is not paid for the cost. So in the case of Moon Girl, that means you're only ever going to be able to draw 3 cards off of her ability, because even if you produce 4 mental resources, only 3 of those are getting paid for her cost. The 4th one is being overpaid and is not going to trigger her ability. Unfortunately, this has a bit of a negative interaction with Wasp and Ant-Man and their respective power-ofs, because the power-ofs only double when they are paying for such and such a card. And a cost with 0, these cards are never actually paying for the cost of the card. They're always overpaying. So when playing Wasp with the power of aggression, you are going to, unfortunately, not double. That's another thing that if you don't play that way, I'm certainly not going to come to your house and police it. A cool thing in the direction of cost payment is that they have codified that when paying for the cost of an ability on something, you are paying for that type of card. So that's what lets Finesse pay for Yarnbjorn, and it's what lets the Power in All of Us double when paying for CITT. They give us the rule that resource abilities can only be triggered, or if the resource ability can only be used to pay for a certain sort of thing, it can only be triggered when you're paying for that sort of thing. So it used to be technically true that you could use Gauntlet Gun whenever you were paying any cost to just create an ammo counter. But now, because it creates resources specifically for a War Machine event, you must be resolving a War Machine event to use Gauntlet Gun. All right. They've given rules about when each player is instructed to do things. So that happens if there's no given order, it happens in player order, first player, and then following clockwise. Also, if an effect like this one whiffs for one player, so normally in this case, it would be running through the entire deck without hitting the, whatever kind of card you're trying to find. The effect continues resolving for any other players that have not resolved it. So you don't get a full get out of free card if the first player somehow runs through the whole deck with this. You have to keep resolving it. They clarified when the end of the player phase and end of phase effects happen, which means to me, my X-Men, when you play it, the ally is going to end up in your hand after you draw up to your hand size. So you're going to get +1 hand size the turn after you play To Me, My X-Men. 1.5 clarifies that when you draw up to your hand size, you draw cards one at a time, and you check your hand size after each draw. So that makes Connection to the World Mind work as intended. It also helps Star-Lord's helmet. That's how drawing up goes. 1.5 updates hinder to happen when a card is put into play and not require revealing, which was really important for this scenario because technically this card was put into play and not revealed, so hinder didn't actually work on it, although of course it was intended to. Kind of reversing a recent-ish ruling, they decided that starting hit points, very simply, is just synonymous with your printed hit points. So effects like Dauntless don't care what you actually started with in a game, especially if you're using like campaign rules. It just means printed hit points. So if your HP is equal to or greater than your printed hit points, you get the retaliate from Dauntless. 1.5 slightly changes the definition of identity-specific cards to be tied not to the name in the bottom, but actually to the little picture, which allows the identities themselves to be considered identity-specific cards, which helps us if we're playing Ghost Spider and you're exhausted and you resolve the effect of Ticket to Multiverse. When you ready each Ghost Spider card you control, you get to ready Ghost Spider. So good for us. Face down cards that are attached to other cards are out of play, and when the card that they are attached to leaves play, those cards are discarded. That's what this reminder text is referring to. Rules Reference 1.5 adds a rule that has been lovingly referred to as the Learn to Play rule, because it's been in the game since the beginning of the game, but has only been printed so far in the Learn to Play, and actually was not in the Rules Reference Guide. So that rule is that for each trigger condition, you can only trigger your any given interrupt or response once per that trigger condition. So really common, or a good way to demonstrate this is energy barrier. Let's say I have 2 energy barriers out and I take 3 damage. I cannot trigger 1 energy barrier 3 times. That's blocked by the Learn to Play rule. Because I'm taking damage, I can only trigger it once. However, multiple different cards can all be triggered for the same trigger condition. So if I have 2 energy barriers and I'm about to take 3 damage, I can trigger each of them once and take the remaining damage. I kind of like to think of this rule as the Black Widow rule, because I like to point out that if this rule did not exist, Black Widow would just be able to murder the villain every single time you played a single preparation card by just repeatedly triggering Widowmaker. So sorry, Black Widow, we don't get to auto-win anymore. Another kind of funny update in 1.5 is main scheme stages actually advance themselves on their own now. So the core sets schemes and the Green Goblin schemes usually involve instructions to advance from scheme stages A to B, but basically every other scenario after that, or even things as old as Crossbones, lack that instruction. So I'm guessing you have not played every single scenario in the game just sitting on 1A forever, so you probably already do this, but it is now technically true. 1.5 gives rules to otherwise. Otherwise, the sentence that follows otherwise only happens if the sentence before it entirely fails to happen. So if you attach this to a minion that has tough, part of the first sentence still happens, so otherwise doesn't come into play. So basically, in the case of this card, there needs to be entirely no minion for it to be attached to at all in order for otherwise to trigger. Damage, overkill damage is very clearly damage from an attack. So if you deal damage to Venom with overkill, attacking a minion and overkilling to him, that will trigger a response like Tooth and Nail because he is taking damage from an attack. Speaking of overkill, Tough has a superpower of preventing overkill from happening. So if Colossus is tough and he's taking damage from an attack with overkill, you are not going to suffer any overkill damage. If Armored Guard is tough and he's suffering damage from an attack with overkill, you're not going to suffer, or the villain is not going to suffer any overkill damage. That's like not technically true without a rule saying so because of how dealing and taking an overkill work, but they've given Tough the superpower because that's how they want it to work. They want Tough to block overkill. So Tough just prevents overkill from happening by its own nature. Rules about ownership and control have been updated. So when you attach an upgrade to a character that someone else controls, they gain control of that card. So no, you cannot kill your friends with your Clarity of Purpose because you own it. They become the controller once it's attached to them and they can resolve it how they want. Also, if there's campaign or scenario specific cards, if you gain control of them, you're considered their owner until another player takes control of them. So that helps those things technically work. If you control 2 upgrades with a restricted keyword and you want to play a third one, you can do so, and you just need to discard another one until you're down to having 2 restricted cards. So the restricted limit works exactly like the ally limit now. You can overwrite it. Icons inside of a card's text box are abilities, which means if Vivian blanks a side scheme with an icon on it, she prevents the icon from happening because it is an ability in their text box. Tough, officially, if you take damage and you have multiple toughs, you're going to only remove 1 at a time. It prevents the damage is still dealt, but yeah, Tough is good. Treacheries that instruct the villain to attack are technically resolved before the attack actually happens and goes into the discard pile. If the effect has another effect after the attack, it's not resolved yet and doesn't go into the discard pile until after that secondary effect. This probably is almost never going to matter, but if you really, really care about what cards are in what pile exactly when things get reshuffled, that's how these cards work. Victory has been updated to apply to attachments when they are removed from play or when they run out of uses. Technically, it used to only apply to things that are defeated, so this card would actually never go into the victory display. But now, if there's an attachment with victory and it leaves play, for whatever reason, the card goes into the victory display. Villain defeat works the way that they intend. If a villain is attacking you and Spider UK kills them, if the next villain is the same villain, the attack continues. But if the next villain is a different villain, such as in the case of Mansion Attack, the attack will not happen. If a villain is defeated, all the cards and things on it stay, including upgrades, unless the next villain in the deck is a different villain, in which case everything falls off. So villain defeat works probably the way that you thought it would. When defeated, it's officially triggered before the card that they are on leaves play, which is, kind of necessary for them to work in the first place, but that's just made official now. Cards leave play after the when defeated deck effect triggers. They ruled in the case of Fabian Cortez that they leave play really quickly. So he is going to, when defeated, put a Acolyte minion into play, but he will actually be discarded before that card's teamwork triggers. So if he were the only other target, teamwork will not work in that situation. So when defeated happens before the card that it's on leaves play, but the card leaves play really, really fast, like before anything else can possibly trigger. If an effect is generating a wild resource and you double the number of resources that you are producing, you can spend each of those resources as whatever kind you would like. So they can be different. So if you control a honed technique and you're playing a no quarter, you can use the power of regression to pay for it and produce a physical and a mental resource, and you get everything you ever wanted. Entering play, minions entering play and quick strike have been changed. So in 1.4, those were split into 2 separate steps. So the minion entered play and then it engaged. That has been undone. It is now just 1 step. When the minion enters play, it engages a player. So there's no middle ground where it has no play area to be in. There's no like limbo. It's just immediately in someone's play area. That affects certain hero abilities negatively. So like the hero response on Widow's Bite, it doesn't preempt Quick Strike. The attack is already going to begin happening, and then Widow's Bite can trigger. If you kill that minion, the attack is stopped. But stunning the minion does not result in them, does not cause the attack to be controlled, to be replaced by stunned, because it already has started happening. It's going to finish happening. So mostly an L for us on that one, but hopefully helping some rules clarity going forward. 1.5 included a lot of errata and FAQs. I'm not going to mention every single one here, especially since those are fairly easy to just read through. If you have questions about one that I didn't mention, please ask. Operation Zero Tolerance and effects like it have what I refer to as superpowers because they don't say where to place the ally from. It can grab the ally from anywhere. So it doesn't matter if that ally ended up in your deck or in the victory display. It's going to grab that ally and put it under this side scheme. There's an FAQ describing that Powerful Punch and Shadowcat's phased form responses work exactly like I said they would. So go ahead and watch that video if you want. With updates to how Overkill works and dealing and taking of damage, Wild Mojo actually doesn't work like the Mojo insert says it does, because now Overkill cares about how much damage is dealt. So Wild Mojo is not going to double dip on overkill damage. So the original target of an attack is dealt a certain amount of damage. That determines how much overkill is being done. And then that amount of damage is dealt to whoever's taking overkill, either the villain or the player. And that amount, when you're about to take it, it'll be increased by 1 by Wild Mojo. Berserker Barrage and Steel Fist have both been errated to not be quite as brain-bendy as they were to us when they were first released. So they no longer involve cost arrows, and they work probably how you think they should. They don't have any particularly weird interactions with stunned anymore. They don't get through it. They're things that used to be templated as costs are just like optional things that you can choose to resolve their last sentence of or not. And finally, one of my personal favorites, Armor Up, has gotten an errata to say when the villain would activate so-and-so. So remember that interrupts are now given a new timing. If they say would, they definitely trigger before the triggering condition initiates. So that causes Armor Up to work the way that they want it to. It will resolve before the enemy activation actually initiates, which means by the time the enemy activation does initiate, they're going to care about what form you're in, and it will have been affected by the effect of Armor Up. So that's everything I stacked. Hopefully that was not super long and hopefully clear. If you have any questions about anything, drop it in the comments. I would love to help. If there is something you would be interested in a more in-depth dive on, please let me know. I'd be very happy to do that. I think Valid Target and Defense and Damage are probably good contenders for future videos. I just hope you guys enjoyed this and keep going out there and playing a bunch of Marvel Champions. Peace out, everybody.